September 17th, 1826, in Bourbon County, Kentucky. Beneath Edward Stone's house, in a crawl space that smelled of earth and despair, 75 human beings waited in chains. They could hear the footsteps above them, the slave trader moving through his home, sharing a meal with his nephew Howard, and after counting his profits. The iron shackles bit into wrists and ankles, but worse than the physical pain was the knowledge of what awaited them. The Mississippi slave market, the cotton fields of the Deep South, a death sentence dressed in the language of commerce. What those traders didn't know was that some of those chained souls had already made a decision. They would rather die fighting than arrive at their destination. This is the story of the Kentucky River Escape Revolts, a chapter of American history written in blood and courage on the waters that separated slavery from freedom. Welcome to Historic Crimes TV, where you get the true story of events that have happened in the past, which helped shape the history of the world that we are living in. Before we begin, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Kentucky in the 1820s occupied a peculiar position in the geography of American slavery. It was a border state, its northern edge defined by the Ohio River, a liquid border between bondage and liberty. On the Kentucky side, tobacco fields, hemp farms, and the constant terror of the auction block. On the opposite shore, Indiana and Ohio, free states where the Constitution itself proclaimed slavery illegal. But that border was porous, contested, and soaked in blood. The bluegrass region around Lexington and Louisville had become a major hub of the interstate slave trade. Kentucky wasn't just maintaining its enslaved population. It was exporting human beings by the thousands, shipping them downriver to feed the insatiable appetite of the expanding Cotton Kingdom. Traders like Edward Stone had built fortunes on this traffic in human flesh. For the enslaved, the word downriver carried the weight of doom. To be sold down the Mississippi meant separation from family forever, brutal labor in the cotton fields of Mississippi and Louisiana, and likely death within a few short years under the brutal regime of Deep South slavery. But Kentucky's position as a border state cut both ways. While traders moved enslaved people south along the rivers, whispers moved north. Stories of successful escapes, tales of underground railroad stations just across the Ohio River in Indiana, names of conductors who would help guide runaways to freedom. By the mid-1820s, enslaved people in Kentucky knew something their enslavers tried desperately to suppress. Freedom was close. Tantalizingly close, just a river's width away. In Bourbon County, in the summer of 1826, Edward Stone had assembled a particularly valuable cargo. 75 enslaved people, men, women, and children of various ages. He kept them chained beneath his house, a human warehouse of misery. Stone was not a small-time operator. This was a major shipment destined for the auction blocks downriver. But among those 75 souls, a conspiracy was forming. The enslaved were marched from Bourbon County to Mason County, Kentucky, where the Ohio River ran wide and dark. There, they were loaded onto a flatboat, one of the thousands of such vessels that moved goods and people down America's inland waterways. David Cobb of Lexington and James Gray had been hired to convey this human cargo south. A flatboat was essentially a large wooden raft with walls, measuring perhaps 40 to 60 feet long and 12 to 15 feet wide. It had no means of propulsion except the current itself and long poles for steering away from snags and sandbars. Once you put a flatboat on the river, you were committed to going downstream until you reached your destination or disaster. The enslaved were packed into the hold, chains connecting them in lines. Above deck, the white crew moved about, confident in their control. They had done this journey before. They knew the river. They had guns, knives, and a law on their side. What they didn't have was an understanding of what desperation could breed in the human heart. The flatboat stopped in Louisville, Kentucky's largest city and a major slave trading center. There, a white man identified as either Davis from Natchez, Mississippi, or Davis from Paris, Kentucky, boarded the vessel. With 5 white men now aboard, the 2 hired crew, Stone and his nephew Howard and Davis, the journey continued. The flatboat drifted southwest, following the Ohio River's course. Limestone bluffs rose on either side. The forest pressed close to the water. At night, you could see fires on the northern shore, free soil, so close you could almost swim to it. Approximately 100 miles downriver from Louisville, everything changed. On that September day, in 1826, 75 enslaved people rose up against their captors. In the confined space of that flatboat, with nowhere for the white men to run, the revolt was swift and terrible. Edward Stone, the man who had kept human beings chained beneath his house like livestock, fought for his life. His nephew Howard fought beside him. David Cobb and James Gray, the hired hands, found themselves in a battle they never expected. Davis, the late addition to the journey, discovered his travel plans had taken a fatal turn. The enslaved had somehow obtained weapons by stealing them from the crew and bringing concealed knives or improvised weapons. Gunshots rang out across the water. Screams echoed against the bluffs. Blood spilled on the deck. When it was over, all 5 white men were dead. Their bodies were thrown overboard into the Ohio River, consigned to the same waters they had used to transport human cargo. Now, 75 formerly enslaved people stood on a flatboat drifting down the Ohio River. Behind them, certain death if captured. Ahead, a chance at freedom if they could reach the northern shore. Indiana beckoned. The state had entered the Union in 1816 with a constitution that prohibited slavery. More importantly, there were active underground railroad stations along the Indiana shore, particularly in areas near Breckinridge County, Kentucky. Some of the escaped enslaved people may have known about these stations. Perhaps the revolt itself had been planned with this knowledge in mind. The flatboat was steered toward the Indiana shore. As it made landfall, 75 people scattered into the forest, running for their lives toward what they hoped would be freedom. Men, women, and children disappeared into the wilderness. Some traveled alone, some in small groups. They moved through dense forest, crossed streams, navigated by the North Star. Every snap of a twig, every distant voice could mean recapture. The penalty for slave revolt was death. Not just death, but public execution designed to terrorize anyone else who might contemplate resistance. The fugitives had made a critical miscalculation about Indiana. While the state's constitution prohibited slavery, it had passed one of the nation's earliest fugitive slave laws in 1824, just 2 years before the revolt. This law declared that escaped enslaved people remained property that could be legally reclaimed by their owners or traders. Moreover, while there were indeed underground railroad stations in Indiana, there were also slave catchers, bounty hunters, and plenty of white residents who were sympathetic to Kentucky slave owners or simply motivated by the rewards offered for returned property. The alarm went out. A major slave revolt had occurred on the Ohio River. 5 white men were dead. 75 escaped enslaved people were loose in Indiana. Posses formed on both sides of the river. The manhunt was relentless and effective. One by one, small groups were tracked down and captured. Within days, 56 of the 75 had been recaptured and returned to Kentucky. They were lodged in the Hardinsburg jail in Breckinridge County. But 19 remained free. 19 people managed to evade the slave catchers and disappear into the vast spaces of the American Midwest. To this day, we know nothing about their fates. Did they make it to Canada? Did they build new lives under assumed names in Indiana or Ohio? Did they die in the forest, preferring death to recapture? For the recaptured, the consequences were severe. The legal system moved swiftly. 3 of the captured enslaved people admitted to participating in the revolt. 5 were sentenced to death by hanging: Joe, Duke, Resin, Stephen, and Wesley. These are the only names we have from the 75 souls on that flatboat. 5 names preserved in newspaper accounts of their executions, while the others remain anonymous in the historical record. The executions were public spectacles, designed to send a message to every enslaved person in Kentucky. Resistance means death. The remaining captured enslaved people were sold. A Baltimore newspaper reported that some were taken to Maryland and auctioned. Others were sold locally or shipped further downriver. the very fate they had killed to avoid. One person escaped both execution and re-enslavement, a young mulatto man named Lewis, who had been Edward Stone's body servant. According to accounts, during the revolt, Lewis had tried to save Stone's life. He was beaten by the other enslaved people for his efforts, but survived both the revolt and the recapture. 4 months after the incident, in January 1827, Stone's widow granted Lewis his freedom, the only person from that flatboat to gain legal emancipation. Lewis remained in Kentucky, living on land near the Stone house. Whether he genuinely felt loyalty to Stone or had played a deeper game, acting as if he supported Stone while secretly knowing about or even supporting the revolt, we'll never know. The 1826 flatboat revolt was not an isolated incident. It was part of a broader pattern of resistance along Kentucky's rivers. 3 years later, on August 14, 1829, history repeated itself near Greenup, Kentucky, at the mouth of the Little Sandy River. James G. Gordon, another slave trader, was transporting a group of enslaved people downriver. Like Stone before him, Gordon was moving human cargo to the Deep South markets, and like the 1826 revolt, the enslaved people rose up. During the rebellion, Gordon was shot, beaten, and left for dead. 16 enslaved people escaped into the Indiana wilderness. The response was even more brutal than in 1826. 5 enslaved people were executed for the Greenup Revolt. 4 were hanged at Greenupsburg, now Greenup, Kentucky, on November 20th, 1829, with the Ohio River and the hills of free territory visible in the distance. So close to freedom, yet dying in chains. The Greenup Revolt reached beyond local newspapers. The story appeared in the Portsmouth, Ohio press, then was reprinted in the Scioto Gazette in Chillicothe, and from there spread across the nation. It caught the attention of David Walker, one of the most radical abolitionists of his era. Walker was compiling his famous pamphlet, Walker's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, but in particular and very expressly to those of the United States of America. At the last minute, he added the Greenup Revolt to his text. Walker's Appeal, published in September 1829, was an incendiary document that called openly for enslaved people to rise up in armed rebellion against their enslavers. It terrified the South and inspired abolitionists, and it held up the Greenup rebels as examples of courage, people willing to fight and die rather than submit to slavery. The Kentucky River Revolts had become part of the arsenal of the abolitionist movement. Nearly 2 decades after Greenup, Kentucky witnessed what historians consider one of the largest planned slave escape attempts in American history. In August 1848, between 55 and 75 armed enslaved people from Fayette County and surrounding areas organized a mass escape attempt. Unlike the spontaneous revolts on the flatboats, this was a carefully planned operation. A white man named Patrick Doyle had agreed to guide them to freedom in Ohio, apparently for payment from each person. The fact that dozens of enslaved people could organize, arm themselves, accumulate money, and plan a coordinated escape speaks to the sophisticated resistance networks that existed in Kentucky. The escapees moved through Kentucky, heading toward the Ohio River and freedom. They made it as far as Bracken County before being confronted by approximately 100 armed white men led by General Lucius B. Desha. A gunfight erupted. In the chaos, about 40 of the escaped enslaved people broke away and ran into the woods. Like the 19 who escaped from the 1826 flatboat, these 40 vanished into history. The rest, including Patrick Doyle, were arrested. The captured enslaved people were returned to their enslavers. Doyle was convicted by the Fayette Circuit Court and sentenced to 20 years of hard labor in the state penitentiary. The Kentucky River escape revolts weren't accidents of history. They emerged because of geography. Kentucky's position as a border state created both intense slave trading, as people were shipped south, and proximity to freedom, the Ohio River and free states beyond. This combination created desperation and opportunity simultaneously. The interstate slave trade, being sold downriver, meant almost certain death within years. People facing this fate had nothing left to lose. Information networks, Despite laws prohibiting enslaved people from learning to read or gathering freely, information still spread. People knew about underground railroad stations in Indiana. They knew about successful escapes. Knowledge breeds hope, and hope breeds resistance. The river itself. The flatboat journeys created a unique tactical situation. Once on the river, the crew couldn't call for backup. They couldn't retreat. And the enslaved people, though chained, outnumbered them significantly. If they could break their chains and obtain weapons, the confined space of a flatboat became an advantage rather than a prison. On quiet days along the Ohio River, where Kentucky meets Indiana, you can still find the places where these revolts occurred. The rivers still flow. The forests still grow thick along the banks. The waters still move south, as they did when they carried those flatboats loaded with human cargo. But if you listen carefully, and this is what the descendants of enslaved people will tell you, you can hear something else in those waters. Not just the current, not just the wind. You can hear the echo of chains breaking, the splash of bodies thrown overboard, the shouts of people running for freedom through dark woods. You can hear resistance, and that sound, once heard, is impossible to forget. In memory of Joe, Duke, Resin, Stephen, Wesley, and the dozens of others whose names we'll never know, who chose death over slavery and freedom over submission. May their courage never be forgotten. If you don't like slavery or modern-day slavery and think there should be more benefits to the communities that it affected, click the subscribe button. Slave appealers won't.